Hello, company, and welcome to the Show People podcast, the podcast that shines a spotlight on the UK performing arts industry and those dedicated to their craft. My name is Andrew Keats. I'm a theatre director and the artistic director of Queer Theatre, and your host. Now, tonight's guest is a legendary gay playwright, screenwriter, and author, perhaps best known for writing landmark gay play Bent, as well as other stunning plays such as When She Danced, Messiah, Cracks, Gently Down the Stream, and many, many others. On screen, his credits include Mrs Henderson Presents, The Roman Spring of Mrs Stone, Callas Forever, Alive and Kicking, and The Clothes in the Wardrobe. Across theatre and film, he has been nominated for 2 Tony Awards, 2 Olivier Awards, and 2 BAFTA Awards. He has crafted queer stories throughout the decades. Please welcome to the stage, Martin Sherman! Chair a little bit forward.
I'm very confused. Where's the couch? I was told this was Graham Norton.
I'm Camper.
Where? Oh.
And so are you. Let's start off with the most important question. Have you been to the Two Brewers before?
I have, yes, I have.
What's your earliest memories of the Two Brewers?
Oh, no, I'm very old. I don't have memories.
So, you've written your memoir. What was that like to do as a process?
It was shockingly easy. I only wrote it because I often told people stories about my family, particularly my father. Mm-hmm. And people said, oh my God, he's such an incredible character. You really ought to write a play about him. And I couldn't face the idea of writing a play about my family because it meant that I would have to go to rehearsal every day and live through it every day in rehearsal, and then go see the play every night and live through my childhood again, which I absolutely was not prepared to do. So I thought, well, maybe I can write it as a memoir, and that'll be once, and I'll get it over with. And so I started to do it, and I thought it was going to be hell because I was reliving very painful things. And it was easy. That's what was so strange. Once it started, I just flew. But I thought when I got past my family, there was nothing to write about. So I thought it was going to be very, very small. And I would talk about my childhood and then sort of jump to some years later. And there was nothing that interesting in between. And I was shocked at the things that came out and how, I guess, eventful and curious my life was along the way. So I had a great deal to write about, and that I didn't know. I thought I had a little bit to write about that might be interesting. I had no idea I had a great deal to write about, and I did.
I wonder if you wouldn't mind reading the prologue from this. I have to say, it's been a real privilege to walk literally on your steps along the boardwalk, as it were, through this incredible autobiography. I think every queer theatre maker should have it on their shelf, and I'm sure our friends at Incandescent would agree. But to set the tone of your life, I think the prologue is probably the greatest thing you could read for us. Would you mind reading it?
No. This, I'm doing the, what do they call it?
Audiobook?
Yeah. I was not an average queer boy. I looked like a survivor from Dachau. I was 6 feet tall. I weighed just 107 pounds. I had a face consumed with acne. There were oozing sores surrounding my oversized nose, and my protruding teeth hung like an umbrella over my lower lip. It was 1960, and I was 21. An adult at last, but probably not for long. It was generally assumed I would inherit a diabolical neurological disease that ravaged my family, and that within 20 years I would be of vegetables. Actually, 20 years later, I had a play running on Broadway. Go figure. My father always claimed, much to my displeasure, that I was a miracle baby. He and my mother had tried for some time to conceive without success. Finally, he prayed and told God that if he was blessed with the baby, he would only ask for 10 years of happiness, a peculiar bargain and one which God honored with a vengeance. My father didn't really believe in God, so the story was an elaborate fabrication designed to distract from the inconvenient truth that my parents should not have been trying to have me at all. Not with a hereditary disease that had destroyed so much of my mother's family, as well as my possible future. Bringing a child into the world under those particular circumstances was virtually criminal. And what kind of emotional pressure did it put on my mother, knowing she was more than likely consigning me to a life of hell? I cannot begin to imagine what she thought, because I barely remember anything my mother ever said. I can barely remember a single emotion she expressed. She left no tangible legacy, either verbal or physical, unless the void can be considered legacy. So in theory, I should be angry that I was conceived, and I am. But I am also irrevocably grateful. The worst hell of all would have been non-existence. Thus, a good thing can be bad, a bad thing good, pleasure pain, and joy unbearably sad. There are always at least two sides. A character in one of my plays says her guiding principle is, on the other hand, the disease was Huntington's. In those days, it was officially termed Huntington's chorea, and relatively little was known about it. What they did know is that it was inherited and that the earliest symptoms were often subtle problems with mood, followed by a general lack of coordination, an unsteady gait, and involuntary jerking movements, followed by very understandable depression, followed by complete physical and mental chaos, with speaking and thinking severely impaired. Now, I've sugarcoated the description. That's the Disney version, because even now I cannot bear to accurately say what it was like. I am aware that this is no way to begin a memoir, but then neither is it a way to begin a life. Rest assured, it gets better, although it takes a while.
Well done. Beautiful. Tell me, let's talk about your mother. You mentioned in the book about this recurring memory of a boardwalk. Would you mind sharing that with us?
Oh, I don't remember how old I was. I'd probably say in the book, I was very young, and I was walking with my mother and a friend of hers on the boardwalk in Atlantic City. And I was holding their hands because I guess I could walk by myself, but I think just, barely. And they were talking. And I have no memory of what they were talking about. I have no memory of what my mother said. But my memory of that walk on the boardwalk comes back to me all the time for over 80 years. So something crucial was spoken, because that's why you remember a moment. Something has happened in that moment, and you don't know what it is or what it's about, but something has happened that triggers things in your psyche, and you remember them. You keep remembering them, but you don't know what it was. And I don't know what was said. I don't know what my mother said.
Tell me about your mother. What did she do? What are your memories of her?
She didn't do anything because it was a time in which women were expected to be housewives, and not to be professionally active. But I can't tell you about my mother because I don't know. When I was a child, we were very close, but I have no memory of what that closeness was. I don't know. I have no memory of anything she ever said to me. And then when I must have been about 6 or 7, the disease began to activate itself within her system, and she became increasingly remote and increasingly disabled. It's one of the most horrifying diseases in the world, and it is really very difficult to describe. But it destroys a person's personality and their movement and their speaking and their thinking very slowly, very slowly. And it begins to manifest itself when you're in your 30s, really. And it becomes quite apparent when you're in your 40s. And then it just is convulsive. But I don't know what she was about, because she must have been in such incredible pain, such incredible psychic pain, because this thing was happening to her. It happened to her father, to a grandparent. It was happening to her brother as well. And doctors didn't know what it was then. So she couldn't have been absolutely sure what was happening to her. Today, we're very used to knowledge about illness. So if someone is diagnosed with a terrible illness, they can look it up. The doctors will have a lot of knowledge. There will be information. So at least you have a sense of what's happening to you, or what might happen to you, or what you can do about it. There was nothing. Doctors were not interested in Huntington's because very, very few people had it, which meant that there was no money in it. And it wasn't worth having research. The medical profession only became interested in the early 1960s, when the wife of Woody Guthrie, who was a great the great original American folk singer, actually, went public with the fact that he had Huntington's, and put an ad in the New York Times asking if there were other people who had Huntington's in their family. And she stirred up public interest. And as a result, doctors saw that it was financially lucrative to do something about this. And they started doing research. And ultimately, they isolated the gene that causes it. And they were able to develop a test that you can take to tell whether you're going to develop it or not. But that was long after I was out of that pasture. And a few months ago, they made an incredible breakthrough. And they are now able to experiment with some kind of operation that can do something to your brain cell that can possibly stop it or stem it, which is a tremendous, tremendous advance.
The relief.
But my mother knew none of this, and so she didn't know what was happening to her. She must have, if she could be aware that it was hereditary, she would then know that the odds were that I would get it. So she would be filled with incredible guilt, I would think. When I talk about the fact that my parents should not have had a child, I'm afraid it was my father's ego that caused my conception, because they shouldn't have had a child. My mother had a brother and a sister. Her brother also developed Huntington's. Her sister didn't. And her sister had a lovely husband who didn't like my father. And in those days, I didn't know why. Now I understand. Now I understand. I think they were angry that they had me, that that they brought a child into this. They adopted children. They made a clear decision not to do that. So all of this weighed very heavily on my mother, but she was very sensitive. She wrote poetry when she was young. The poetry was awful, but she and naive as could be, but she wrote it. And she had a book of Shakespeare, which she gave me. And she took me to the theater. She wanted to go to the theater. And these are parts of my mother that I don't understand. These parts saved my life and gave me a life, but I can't equate them with the woman I knew, because she didn't really express the things that created these aspects of her being, other than taking me to the theater when I was a child. But for instance, I started going to the theater on my own because she took me a few times, and then it became too difficult for her, I guess. And so she didn't. So I started going on my own. And she never asked me what the play was like or what it was about or what I had seen. And yet I now know she cared. She cared deeply. So it's a puzzlement and always will be.
What are your earliest memories of theatre and writing when you were that age? Can you remember what you saw?
Yeah. We lived across the river from Philadelphia. And Philadelphia was where Broadway plays came on the way to Broadway or toured after Broadway. So I saw a lot of major Broadway productions at the time. By the time, I'm talking about the 40s, really, and early 50s. So I saw productions from the end of a great phase of the American theater. And there was another one that would, come after that, because things go in phases and circles. But I saw the end of a style of acting that was to be wiped away. And I saw also the actors that wiped it away. But I saw people which won't mean anything to you probably, but there were Helen Hayes, Catherine Cornell, Alfred Lunt and Lynn Fontanne, who were majestic actors of a certain old era. And some of them were good and some of them weren't. And I remember everything. I remember the details of every production and every performance I saw up until the age of 17 or 16, whatever it was that I left home. And I'm sure it's because it was my escape from my home. And so it was very vivid to me. But I don't remember what I saw last week. But, and it's not age in this case. It's not, having past memories and not recent ones. It's just that it was a psychology of being the escape from my house and my family. So I saw, and I was a little kid. I was 8 or 9 or 10 and then 11, 12, 13, 14. I was going to the theater by myself to matinees in Philadelphia, and I was seeing very inappropriate things. I mean, I saw Tennessee Williams plays on the way to Broadway. I remember sitting in an audience of a Saturday matinee of Cat on a Hot Tin Roof. I mean, there was this kid, this little kid sitting Cat on a Hot Tin Roof. I don't know what anybody thought, what it was, and I sort of understood the plays that I saw with enormous sophistication. But in the rest of my life, I had no sophistication at all. And none of that understanding was present in my life. But it somehow was when I saw these plays. It was very strange.
Perhaps one of the biggest figures in the book is, of course, your father, who you talk openly about being a brilliant lawyer and a terrible narcissist. What was it like to survive and be influenced by somebody with essentially a narcissistic personality disorder?
Well, I don't know if I survived it. In a sense, I became some kind of narcissist myself because I wrote a memoir. I mean, that's and probably I was worried about catching the wrong disease. I was worried about my mother's. I wasn't thinking about my father's. My father was informally diagnosed as, I can never remember the something narcissistic syndrome. It's exactly the same thing that Donald Trump has been informally diagnosed with. And it's given me an unusual understanding of Donald Trump, who I think is utterly misunderstood because people don't look at him through the lens of his illness. He's mentally ill. We all know. But there are specifics about his illness that are not discussed and one of the reasons is I think doctors themselves know relatively little about narcissistic complex, probably because people who have it don't go to doctors. They don't think anything's wrong with themselves, so they don't go to therapists or psychiatrists. So they're not examined. So if you Google it and you read what the symptoms are, you read that it's lack of empathy, an inflated view of yourself, a lot of things like that. But there are much else that you don't read. For instance, and the fact that my father, who was a simple lawyer in New Jersey, and a rather nice man, had exactly the same symptoms as Donald Trump, means that these are things in common with the disease. For instance, I'll give you a long example, but My father was a famous lawyer
Mm.
in our community. He handled only criminal cases and divorce, nothing else. His clients were poor, mostly African American. He knew no law. He didn't know any law whatsoever. He failed his bar exam 4 times, and only passed. There was a big political thing. The university had opened a branch where he grew up, and they needed graduates. So he finally passed. But the reason he didn't know law is that law concerns detail, concerns fact, and he couldn't contain things like that. It's part of the disease. He would go into the courtroom, he would take a piece of paper, look at it, and crumple it, put it in his pocket. Actually, the paper had nothing written on it. And then he would proceed, and he would be very dramatic, and he would quote the Bible all the time. He never read the Bible. He made up the quotes. And he was extraordinarily dramatic. And people in the courthouse used to leave their work and run down to the courtroom when my father was delivering his charge to the jury because he was so fantastic. They wanted to see him. And he would, I'll give you an example.
Mm.
I went to a trial once. There was a robbery. 3 men robbed a store. One of the men, who was young, was the getaway driver. The other 2 men robbed a store, and one of them shot and killed the store owner. The court appointed 3 attorneys to represent, each one of the men. The trial was held at the same time. All 3 men were on trial at the same time with 3 different attorneys. The men were Puerto Rican, and this was a time when the prejudice against Puerto Ricans in America was so astonishing. We can see with what's happening today how profound it is. It was even worse. It was so these guys had public opinion totally against them. My father was representing the man who shot and killed the store owner. My father's client was guilty of murder. The boy who drove the car had no idea that the shop owner was going to be killed. He was guilty of robbery, but he was not guilty of murder. He had a lawyer, and his lawyer spoke to the jury and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, the jury, my client over here, I don't know what he's done." That was his lawyer. My father, "Look at this boy. Look at him. The Bible says, 'Thou shalt not harm the hair of a child who crossed over the river.'" It was all nonsense, but it was very, very dramatic. My father's client, who was guilty of murder, was given a life sentence, which meant that in 15 or 20 years, it was possible for him to walk free. The boy who drove the car, who was innocent of murder, was executed. it was shocking. My father was was extraordinary. He got everybody off, or in a case like that, a, a good deal. I asked the prosecutor once what case of my father he remembered the most. And he said, yes, we had a case. We had a guy up for robbery. We had every bit of evidence you could possibly have. We had him cold. And we presented all the evidence to the jury. And then your father got up and said, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what has the prosecution just presented to you? Facts. What good are facts? He believed it, and the jury believed it, and his client got off. The inability to believe in facts is, I am convinced, a symptom of the narcissistic syndrome, because we see it with Donald Trump all the time. We assume that a great deal of what he does is planned and thought about. It's not. It's part of his illness. Even things like Greenland. Denmark owns Greenland. That's a fact. That's not important to him. He can't absorb that because it's a fact. He wants Greenland. That's something he knows. But a fact is nonsense to him. And so it was with my father. And his resemblance to Donald Trump, even though they couldn't have been more different, was huge. So I grew up living with somebody like that. If you got into, you would get into an argument with my father about something. And then after 5 minutes, you would realize that he was now arguing the absolute opposite of what he started out with. And you were on the other side, and you didn't know how you'd gotten there. It was impossible. It was impossible to deal with.
How, obviously, you were talking about being a younger man, but as you grew older, as you became an adult before going to Boston, how did you feel towards your father in the end? Was it to run away? What did you want to become the antithesis of?
No,
Did you
because you only, what you grow up with seems normal. So you don't know. You have no idea how bizarre your circumstances are until you're much older. I had no idea. I didn't understand my father. I didn't understand my mother. I thought what was going on was what went on.
So you went to Boston University, and then you would go on to the Actors Studio. Somebody I didn't expect you to be taught by was Lee Strasberg. Was Lee Strasberg a big figure in your life? And what were the things that he taught you?
No,
That stay with you.
I wasn't taught by Lee Strasberg. When I was living in New York, I was accepted by the Actors Studio Playwrights unit. The Actors Studio was not a school. It was a studio. And actors went to, if they were accepted, to do scenes, try out their skills. It was a workshop place, basically. Lee Strasberg was the teacher, but he would have been called the moderator, but he was a teacher. And they had a playwrights unit and a director's unit. And Harold Clurman, who was the founder of Group Theater with Lee Strasberg, was in charge of the playwrights unit. But when I had a play done there, and Clurman was away, and Lee Strasberg took the session. But I used to go to all of Lee Strasberg's classes, because if you were in the playwrights unit, you were allowed to go to the acting unit and directing unit. So I went to Strasbourg's classes all the time for several years. And he was a brilliant teacher and an awful teacher at the same time. Because basically, most of his students misunderstood him. And if you're misunderstood by your pupils, you're not a good teacher. He assumed that the people who he was working with, had tools of their craft, that they knew how to navigate a stage, that they knew how to speak, that they had craft. So he didn't concentrate on that. He concentrated on emotional truth. Most of his students thought, therefore, that the emotional truth was the only important thing, and that craft was meaningless. But that's not what he was about. When he was asked who the best actor he ever saw on stage was, he didn't say Marlon Brando. He said John Barrymore, who that generation would have considered a ham. When he was asked who was the greatest actress he ever saw on stage, he said Maria Callas. So he was not what people assumed he was, but they did assume that, and he was a teacher, and it was his fault. So it was curious, but I learned a lot.
What were some of the things that have kept you in good stead from those classes? Is there anything that still ticks away in the back of your head when you're writing a play or when you're working with an actor?
Yeah, technical things. That's what's so strange. Technical things about a life in the theater. The things that people ignored. I mean, for instance, something I always remember that he said was, if you're, in those days, plays went out of town before they came to Broadway. There were no workshops, or you played out of town and then came into Broadway. And he said, if the play was out of town and something was wrong, and people had the feeling that something was wrong somewhere, do not listen to any of the specifics they say about how to fix it, what to do. Don't listen to that. But pay attention to the spots they're talking about. Because there will be something wrong there. But the solutions will not be the solutions. But pay attention to where they sense the trouble is. That was a great lesson. The lessons like that, many things like that.
But you originally went as an actor, am I right in thinking? When you were younger, you thought you would become an actor.
When I went to, I went to Boston University Theater Division, the acting department. I wanted to be an actor. And I learned very, very quickly that I was terrible. I couldn't do it.
And let's talk about the Playwright's Horizon, because your early work wasn't necessarily well produced, I think it would be fair to say. You had Passing By, we have Cracks, we have Rio Grande. The first question I wanted to ask is, with Passing By, which, as you will know, I was very fortunate to direct in London years later. But we're dealing with the 1970s, and we're dealing with a beautiful, gentle gay play where being gay is not an issue. And my question is, how easy was it to find actors to play gay at that time?
Well, we've taken a huge jump in time. It's now 1970.
Sure.
74, probably. And the Playwrights Horizons had just started. It was founded by a man named Bob Moss, who was a visionary. It was a young producing company in a housed in a YMCA on 8th Avenue. And they did Passing By, impossible to cast, absolutely impossible. Actors did, actors didn't know how to play gay, or didn't want to play gay. Particularly two characters who are adjusted to their sexuality. They probably could have played them if they were suicidal and miserable, or exceptionally camp. But they really literally didn't know how. So it was hard to cast.
And when did you start to feel comfortable exploring your sexuality through the page?
I never thought of it as exploring my sexuality. I just got to a point where I had to write what I knew about.
What do you mean by that phrase?
Not what I knew about, but I had to write out of who I was and out of the sensibility that I had. Yeah.
You would move to London and you would have a production of Passing By done by the Gay Sweatshop. What was it like to leave America behind?
I didn't think of it as leaving America behind. There's a negativity in that. I thought of it as moving to London and living in London. At first, I thought I would live in both London and New York, but that wasn't feasible or sensible. But I didn't think I was leaving America behind. I was, but I didn't realize it.
How was it building a community with people like Gay Sweatshop and building a life here in those early days?
I developed a life here. And when I first came over for Passing By, I met people who I was very comfortable with. I had been to London several times before, and I already knew I wanted to live here. But I really didn't know anybody. Passing By made, and the Gay Sweatshop opened all kinds of doors for me.
So can you share what that great organization was like? Because so many people in this room will have no idea what the Gay Sweatshop was. What's your earliest memories, and how would you share what it was like to be a part of of Gay Sweatshop?
Well, it was formed by a small group of young radical renegades who were very unhappy with the way that gay people were presented on the stage. First of all, they were rarely presented on the stage, and when they were, it was usually in a negative way. There had been a play at the RSC called, I can't remember its name, that had particularly infuriated them. The irony is that it was written by a friend of mine. And they wanted to form a company of gay men and women that would present plays that came out of their sensibility. They didn't have to be about gay subjects, but they were a gay play because the writers were being open about who they were, not in a deliberately sexual way, but their lives were informed by their sexuality and their feelings and their view of the world, just as heterosexual writers wrote about life through the prism of their heterosexuality. They wanted plays that were written by writers through their queerness, as it were. That word wasn't fashionable then. And they hoped, too, that the actors would be gay, which was pretty radical. And so they were invited by the Almost Free Theater, which was a theater on Rupert Street. Why was it called the Almost Free? Could you pay? I guess maybe you could pay whatever you wanted.
I think you told me that before.
I'm not sure.
When we were trying to work out whereabouts on Rupert Street it was.
And they did lunchtime performances. That's something that's gone. But in those days, London was filled with lunchtime theaters. And you went to, I think it's because then British food was so bad. Nobody wanted to really eat at lunch. But there were a lot of theaters. And you could see some tremendous stuff at lunch. So they did a first season, and they did several plays. And my agent had sent them Passing By. And they did Passing By, and I came over for it. And it was the first, besides anything else, it was the first good production I had ever had of anything. Because all of the productions I had had of my work prior to that had been awful. I mean, usually I didn't have productions. Nothing was done. But on the rare occasion that something was done, it wasn't done well. And they were not only visionaries, they were good and professional, and they opened a life for me professionally and politically that had been fuzzy before. They were very important. And the first season was tremendous. Simon Callow was in Passing By. Tony Sher was in another play of theirs. They had amazing young people who wanted to be part of the gay sweatshop.
So let's jump to the play that everybody associates with you, Bent. Where did the spark of Bent come from? Where did you have the idea?
The gay sweatshop. I went to, this was about 2 years later, after Passing By. They did a play called, do you know?
I don't.
I don't remember. It was written by Drew Griffiths and Noel Gregg.
Okay, yeah.
Drew had directed Passing By. He was the founder, one of the two founders of Gay Sweatshop, and was literally a visionary. He was an extraordinary man at the theater, and an extraordinary man. And he wrote the play, his name I've now forgotten, and it took place in 3 segments. In Victorian England, in Germany, the Weimar Republic before the war, and at Stonewall. And they asked me to come to a rehearsal to listen to their American accents, because the last section was in New York. And I watched the play, and in the second section, the Weimar Republic, there was a mention of the fact that ultimately gay men were put into concentration camps. And that section ended, someone had a suitcase, and he turned the suitcase over, and there was a pink triangle on it. And it was this like a flashbulb. I just instantly knew that this was something I wanted to write about. And it was something that nobody really knew about it. So they gave me the little bit of research they had, and then I started doing more research, which was very difficult. And I wrote it for them. I wrote it for the Gay Sweatshop.
I have a recollection. I think we were in your flat once, and you were telling me about, I think it was a book to do with the psychological things that the Nazis did.
Yeah.
And there was a passage you read that really gave you the play.
There's a book by a famous therapist called Bruno Bettelheim, who was a Freudian psychologist, who was arrested and put into Dachau in the very early days when Dachau was a prison camp, not an extermination camp.
Mm-hmm.
And he was actually released after a year and a half. But in order to keep his sanity, he memorized his view of the psychological behavior of the guards and the prisoners. Because it was a rather amazing thing. There were very few guards and a lot of prisoners. And the guards kept control. And how did they keep control? It was through very psychological methods. And Bettelheim clocked all of this and then wrote, when he was released, a book called The Informed Heart, which I couldn't have written Bent without, because it made me understand the psychology of what was going on. It wasn't, The Informed Heart has nothing to do with gay subjects, but it is about the psychology of the camps.
Yeah, isn't that? I think you told me there is a line which is they would drive inmates mad by asking them to move rocks from one place to another.
No, that's another book.
Oh,
I found a few lines in it that talked about the fact that prisoners would sometimes be asked to do useless things like move rocks from one side of a quarry to another. And as soon as I read that, I thought, But you see, the reason I immediately hung on to that when I read it, that goes back to the Actors Studio. That goes back to having a want, a desire, an action in a scene. In order to play a scene, the actor should have an action that he wants to play. And if he plays that action, and it can often be a physical action, everything else will come. Everything else will be there. But you're not acting everything else. You're acting the action. And then all else should be there. And those are the lessons, those are acting lessons. And those are the lessons I learned as a writer, because I am basically a writer for actors. I'm not a writer to be read. And I write to be acted. And so when I came upon that line in the book about moving rocks across the stage, I knew that I had just been given the action from heaven. That was how I could write the play.
Max, Rudy, Greta, did they come from real people you knew?
Well, I think all characters do. Max wasn't one person. You take things from your life, and you take things from people, real things, and you throw them into a pot. And then you take things you've made up, you throw them into the pot. And then you take things that you fantasize and throw them into the pot. Then you take things that you've read about with other people, and you throw them into the pot, and then you stir.
The court wasn't necessarily as enthusiastic about the play as everybody else involved. What was it like? Because you would assume that the Royal Court would see it as a great play and put it on. But that's not true, is it?
No, the Royal Court hated the play. And they didn't want to produce it. But they had no choice, because it had found a producer named Eddie Kolakundis. And there was a director, Robert Chedwin, and they had gotten Ian McKellen to play the lead. And the court was in desperate financial shape. And they were offered a play with Ian McKellen, who even then was a big name. And they couldn't turn it down. They just were not in a position to turn it down. But they didn't like the play and were shocked at its reception. I mean, they were completely nice and professional and lovely, but they didn't like to play. The artistic director phoned me a lot before rehearsals began, and they said, "Oh, this moment when they're having sex, can we change it a little?" I mean,
Wow.
he was very nervous. He was straight, but a lot of people who had been guiding figures of the royal court previous to that, not all, but some of them, some of the paramount figures were gay, but publicly closeted. They would probably think that they weren't, but they were very closeted. And before the royal court had the play, Hampstead had it, and they decided that it should be a gay director. So they sent the play out to a number of gay directors, almost all of whom were these royal court directors. And they all hated the play, hated it, because it threatened them. A lot of gay men of that generation absolutely hated the play.
Would you ever consider other productions of Bent being set in other eras other than Nazi Germany, especially nowadays?
Well, in specific other eras, it can be abstracted, but in specific other eras, no, because it doesn't have to be on the nose in Nazi Germany, but if you made it in Afghanistan, for instance, it would take away from the fact that it could be Afghanistan. If something is good, it'll rise above the specific.
Yeah, the humanity, the universal humanity. Martin, thank you so much. We will be coming back for the second act where we'll look at the rest of Martin's career. But that is the end of part one. For our audience here at the Two Brewers, we'll now be taking a 15-minute interval, so please do grab yourself a drink at the bar. For those tuning at home, backstage, or from the streets of Berlin, please make sure you like and subscribe to the Show People podcast to be notified when part two is released. We would like to extend our gratitude to our incredible sponsors. Theatre Counts, the entertainment industry's trusted accountants, looking after thousands of clients across theatre and performance. The Showreel Company, founded by Ned Wakely, actor and videographer. The Showreel Company makes cinematic showreels with experience on stage and behind the camera. Ned has a sharp eye for story, emotion, and detail, helping make every project stand out. And thank you to Paul Madeley, photographer, offering headshots and commercial photography. A huge thank you to Oliver Blatherwick, Rhys Godfrey, Liam Chaplin at the Two Brewers, and all their gorgeous staff. This podcast is proudly produced by Queer Theatre, committed to telling LGBTQIA+ stories and nurturing queer talent. If you've enjoyed this podcast and would like to support our work, please consider making a donation at queertheatre.co.uk, where you'll also discover details about our weekly acting classes for LGBTQIA+ people, the Queer Play Reading Club, showcases, networking events, parties, and masterclasses. If you're queer, come and be a part of our community. And if you're not, come and be an ally and support our shows like coming to see the Show People podcast live. Finally, please put your hands together for our extraordinary guest, Martin Sherman. Until next time, love always.